Today we're going to discuss Chapter 9, but more specifically Lesson 3, the changing ecosystems. First of all, we're going to discuss how do ecosystems change over time. So natural disasters can change communities and the ecosystem quickly. Even without a disaster, communities still change. The series of predictable changes that occur in a community over time is called secession. Primary secession and secondary secession are the two types of secession that we will discuss today. So primary secession, what exactly is it? Well, let's think about this. When a new island is formed by an eruption of undersea volcanoes, or an area of rock is uncovered by a melting sheet of ice, no living thing is present. But over time, living things will inhabit these areas. Primary secession is the series of changes that occur in an area where no soil or organism exists. So again, we have like an undersea volcano eruption, or a new area is coming up because a sheet of ice melts. No organism is already living there because it was uninhabitable. So the first organisms that do, or excuse me, the series of changes that occur in an area where no soil or organisms exist is the primary secession. Let's talk about now the first organisms that will come there. So let's go back to the volcanic eruption example. So we have a volcanic eruption. No soil had existed there. No organisms exist there, but over time they will. The first species to populate an area is called the pioneer species. They are often carried to the area by wind or water. Typical pioneer species include mosses, lichens. Lichens are like a fungus, or like an algae-like organism growing in a symbiotic relationship. So think about this. Lichens are fungi and algae growing in a symbiotic relationship. And as a review, symbiotic relationship is when two species have some type of relationship and at least one of those species is benefiting. Now, before, in 2 chapters ago, we discussed different types of symbiotic relationships, but this is just the general relationship we're talking about, the symbiotic relationship. As pioneer species grow, they help break up the rock and form soil. When organisms die, they provide nutrients that enrich the layer of soil forming on the rocks. As plant seeds land in the new soil, they begin to grow. The specific plants that grow depend on the climate of the area. For example, in a cool northern area, early seedlings might include cottonwood trees. Eventually, secession may lead to communities of organisms that does not change unless the ecosystem is disturbed. Reaching this mature community can take centuries. If you have a second, go to your book, pause the video, go to your book, get to page 335. Okay, you there? Good. As you can see on page 335, if you have your book, a lot of what I just talked about is coming straight from the book because I wanted to relate the example they had in the book for figure 1. For the soil creation, the pioneer species, volcanic eruption, and then the maturing of the soil and the plants. And the book now asks you to sequence them, order them. Okay, but we're all smart enough here to kind of figure out what came first. But when you read the textbook, you should have already done this, and hopefully you got it right of what comes first, second, third, and fourth. All right, let's move on. The secondary secession. Secondary secession is the series of changes that occurs in the area where the ecosystem has been disturbed, disrupted, something has happened there, but where the soil and organisms still exist. So the main difference between primary and secondary secession is that some event has happened, but soil and organisms still exist there. Okay, it wasn't like a totally new start from the beginning setup, like for primary secession. Natural disturbances that have this effect include fire, hurricanes, tornadoes. Human activities such as farming, logging, or mining may also disturb an ecosystem and cause secondary secession to begin. Unlike primary secession, Secondary secession occurs in a place where an ecosystem currently exists. Secondary secession usually occurs more rapidly than primary secession because soil already exists and seeds from the plant remain in the soil. So let's talk about this, where this happens. So California has wildfires sometimes. Last year, they were in the news a lot because they had a huge wildfire that was affecting parts of California that usually don't get affected. The wildfires spread more. But when this happens, scientists go in and they study the area and they see what organisms are coming back and which ones may be kind of thriving better than they were before the fire when they study it for a period of years. Okay, coastal hurricanes, because hurricanes just don't happen in Louisiana, but along all coastlines, states and countries get storms. But let's just talk about hurricanes that are localized, let's say, to Northern America. So we have the whole eastern seaboard, we have the Gulf Coast. Okay, when we get hurricanes, we see sometimes the influx of plant life after as well. Tornadoes we'll touch on later. But again, unlike primary secession, secondary secession occurs in places where an ecosystem currently exists. Moving on. So let's talk about how do changes in ecosystems affect the survival of organisms. Organisms that survive a changing ecosystem have adaptations that help them survive in the new conditions. Louisiana has an ecosystem called the longleaf pine forest. And if you go to your book, you can see this on 338 if you haven't already read about it. Longleaf pine trees dominate this ecosystem. These trees grow in a pattern that allows plenty of sunlight to shine on the forest floor. The abundant sunlight allows many grasses and other small plants to grow below the trees. However, invasive plants such as oak trees eventually start to grow among the small plants. Without extreme change, the invasive plants crowd out the grasses and the pine trees and eventually dominate the forest. Wildlife will creep in where it can in this as well. Wildfires from lightning strikes occur frequently in the longleaf pine forest and change the ecosystem quickly. Although many of these organisms disappear during a wildfire, they reappear a short time after the fires. Most organisms return because they have adaptations that help them survive fire. So that's just one example, and that's a localized example. It's a Louisiana example that our book gave us of secession, but really how organisms survive and adapt to a changing environment and why they come back to that environment eventually. Okay, which makes sense. Okay, think about it. When we have hurricane and it's a major hurricane, we evacuate, but generally everybody comes back. Okay, because we are used to living here, we have property here, we have businesses that we work at here, so most people come back. But there are cases where some people left for a hurricane and they don't necessarily return. Okay, even though they had family here, they may have had some job here or some ties here, they still, for whatever reason, chose to stay where they went. Okay, but probably 9 out of 10 people came back because they were used to living around here. Now, in the kingdom world, the animal kingdom, plant kingdom, we call this adaptations. Organisms are used to living in an area. They are adapted to live in an area, so there should be the ones that come back. Okay, this is the end of lesson 3 of chapter 9. Have a good rest of your day.